Right, joining me now to look at the new National Development Plan by the federal government is the former Director General, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Muda Yusuf. Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf, for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, looking at this new development plan, it seems a lot is being expected from the private sector, from an investment size of about 348.7 trillion naira. The private sector is expected to provide about 298.3 trillion. What do you make of this high expectation from the private sector?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a reflection of, first, the structure of the economy itself. It's also an acknowledgement of the very important role that the private sector plays in this economy. I think that is what is reflected in this. But again, if you look at practically all sectors of the economy, they are being driven by the private sector. If you take manufacturing, take agriculture, take the services sector, distributive trade, the aviation sector, practically all sectors. Even the social sector that is supposed to be largely dominated by government is now being largely even driven by the private sector. For instance, education. The private sector is playing a very big role now in education, especially in the southern part of the country. The private sector is playing a very big role in health. These are typical sectors where you expect the public sector to be dominant, but the private sector is playing a major role. Even in the area of security. I mean, you can see the number of security firms, agencies that you have around, you know. So the private sector is practically driving all the critical aspects of this economy.
So what then is the role of the government? Because looking at this provision, the public sector, that's the federal and the state government, is just bringing in a paltry 14.3%.
Well, that's not to diminish the role of the public sector. Because even for me, I believe that the expectation from the public sector going by this plan is also too conservative. Because even in the advanced economies, the public sector is still playing a very big role, especially in infrastructure provision. I mean, see what is happening in the United States, where we are talking about over $1 trillion proposed investment in infrastructure. The same thing is happening in China and all of that. So I'm also not too comfortable with a projection of less than 15% in terms of investment over the next 5 years coming from governments. Not just only the federal, we are talking about the federal,
and the
states, and local governments. I think it should be more than that. Because the government has a major role to play. I know the private sector can do a lot in the infrastructure space, but the private sector cannot provide all infrastructure. If United States, that is the #1 market economy in the world, is investing, I'm talking of the government now, investing so much in infrastructure, talk less of a developing country like ours. So the government needs to step up a lot more. And we are seeing this kind of structure because of the structure of government fiscal operations. If you look at the structure of budgets year in, year out, whether it is federal, whether it is state, whether it is local government, practically everything is on recurrent. Many cases, 80% recurrent, 20% capital. We cannot sustain that through this kind of plan. We need to scale up government investment, especially in infrastructure, because the private sector cannot provide all infrastructure, especially in this type of economy. So it has to be a combination of both private and public sector investment, especially in the infrastructure area.
Right. So now looking at the strategies that the government intends to use to actually achieve some of the plans is to broaden the tax base. I mean, you talked about the role the private sector plays in the whole economic structure. Now the question is, who are to be taxed? The same private sector that is supposed to support this infrastructure development?
Yeah, I think the Minister of Finance made this point clearly. She clarified it. And she said that the idea is not to increase the tax rate. The idea is to ensure that you have a broader base for taxation, which means that you have a lot more investment, you create a lot more incentives for investors and investments to grow and all of that. I think that is what the government has in mind when the government is talking about, increasing the tax revenue and broadening the tax base. Because already, I must say that the private sector is almost overtaxed, particularly those who are in the tax net. The pressure on them is quite enormous, and I'm worried even at the unfolding scenario where all the agencies of government and all of them are now being mandated to go and generate revenue. That could put a lot more pressure on the private sector, particularly those that are already paying the tax. And if you look at their percentage compared to the totality of the operators in the economy, it's quite small. Because this economy is almost 50% informal. So this burden of tax is largely on those who are in the formal sector. And you have a situation where in some sectors, the informal sector also competes rigorously with those who are in the formal sector, which is not a fair competition, because the informal sector is largely untaxed because of the structure of operation and the way the tax policy is also configured. It's putting a whole lot of pressure on those who are in the formal sector. So I think the thinking behind this statement, which the government said in this plan, is to ensure that we have a lot more investment. We grow the investment, therefore the tax base will also be broadened.
Yeah,
I think that is the context.
Perhaps the finance minister also talked about incentives. For you, what kind of incentives would you like to see?
Well, she talked about incentives, and this is not the first time we are hearing about incentives. But when it comes to the reality of it, we really don't see much. Even some of the tax incentives and tax waivers that were given in time past, everything is now being rolled back now because government is very bullish in terms of revenue. But when we talk about incentives, we should be looking more at creating an environment that will inspire confidence. That is very basic. Because, again, this is about ensuring continuity. Because when we don't have continuity in the policy space, it's a major issue. So the confidence building process is perhaps even much more critical. Now, take all these plans now. In the last 25 years, we have had the Vision 2010. It was a fantastic document. When the Obasanjo regime came, that was set aside. Then we had the National Economic Empowerment Development Strategy, which was, I think it was Professor Charles Soludo who was the chief economic advisor at the time.
Yes.
That was what Obasanjo put in place. After Obasanjo, we had the 7-point agenda by late Yaradua. After that, we had the transformation agenda by President Jonathan. Now we are talking about, we already had the economic recovery and growth plan, which is lapsing, which is coming to an end this year. Then we are now having this national development plan. The point I'm making here is about consistency. Because when you have a long-term horizon in terms of planning, it inspires a lot more confidence. It also enables investors to plan long-term. But when you have a situation where every government is craving for an identity, you want to set aside the previous programs, you set up your own, just to have an identity. That is not, it's not good for us. It's not only happening at the federal level, it's also happening at the state level.
Right, so do you have concerns that perhaps, this administration has barely less than 2 years to go. We're likely going to see this plan thrown aside.
It is likely, given what the history has been with all these plans. Many of each time a government comes, because this idea of seeing the government as a continuum, it has not properly been embedded in the culture of governance. People feel that if you continue what the previous administration has done, it's as if you have not done anything of your own. So in the process, you have so many abandoned projects, programs, and all of that, which is not good for the economy. So for the state governments, for the federal government, even the local governments, And even our first ladies. Because you have seen each of them, each time they come, they abandon what the former first ladies have been doing and come up with their own.
Absolutely.
And whereas some of them have very, very good programs, which others succeeding first ladies normally should build on. We have seen a lot of things around women, around children, around rural women, and so on. So the issue of continuity and the concerns around seeing government as a continuum is very important. And talking about even other things that the private sector would like to see, the macroeconomic environment is very important. Because sometimes these things are even more important than the so-called incentives. When you have a macroeconomic environment that is not stable, that is very unstable, it doesn't encourage long-term investments. It creates a situation where many investors that come around are people who are looking short-term. Again, that is not good for the economy. Macroeconomic variables like the foreign exchange, you know what the issues has been in the last couple of months around depreciation, volatility, unpredictability, and all of that. The inflationary pressure and the galloping inflation. We're expecting the new inflation figure later today. You can see the level at which inflation is, even though it has been decelerating. But inflation at over 16% is also not a good thing for investment. Then you have issues of policy consistency. Because there is no harmonization. Now you have a plan. The whole idea of a plan is that every aspect or every component or every segment of the government should key into that plan. But what we see in reality is that you have the plan, but everybody is moving in different directions.
Yeah.
There is this territorial mentality among many of the agencies of government.
Okay. Now that brings us to the issue of the business environment, which of course when we talk about quality of business environment, it's say it's very critical, you know, in accelerating economic growth. And I know that recently your center released its business environment update that was for October. Now, looking at this plan, is there a nexus between this?
There is a nexus. Because if the plan is expecting the private sector to invest over 85% of what the total investment should be, then we have to create the environment for the private sector. Because what we have seen over time is that investors are not duly respected in this environment. They are not the kind of courtesy that you should extend to investors. To appreciate the fact that they are contributing so much and they are expected to contribute so much, it's not existent. So there has to be a lot that we need to do around creating the enabling environment. It has become so that one doesn't sound like a broken record. This enabling environment issue is still with us. Even though we have a lot of rhetoric about creating an enabling environment, in reality, nothing much is happening. I mean, look at what is happening now, for instance, with the foreign exchange. Don't say that I'm flogging it a lot more. Because
but that's the major issue,
it is the major issue. And it cuts across all sectors of the economy and all levels of business. The business environment have not had it good at all. I'm not talking about even the cost of the dollar. I'm talking about the stability of the system. I'm talking about the liquidity in the system. There are global variables that has affected the forex, but there are also policy issues that are also contributing to the problem. So that is a major issue in terms of what we find in the global update. I mean the business environment update. Then of course we have the issues with our ports. Again, that has been a recurring problem. The issues of congestion, the issue of the gridlock, and more importantly, the issues of dispute resolution in the international trade process. It's a big issue for investors in this economy, which needs to be urgently addressed. Dispute resolution between the importers or investors and the customs, between the investors and the shipping companies, between the investors and the terminal operators, between the investors and the regulatory agencies like NAFDAC, SON, and all of that. We don't have a credible dispute resolution system. You need that kind of thing to be able to inspire confidence of investors so that the investors are not left completely at the mercy of these agencies, because that is what is happening. Then we are now having issue with high energy costs. Of course, it's good to celebrate high oil price, but again, it's hitting investors in terms of high cost of diesel, high cost of aviation fuel, high cost of kerosene. You know, these are some of the things that we worry about as far as this. Then, of course, the tax rules. We had a discussion around this. We cannot have a situation where you have a dispute with the tax authorities and you are expected to go and pay 50% of the amount in disputes.
Dr. Yusuf, just hold your thoughts there, because in all of this that you have talked about, we would also want to know the kind of proactive role, you know, the private sector can play in ensuring, you know, the realization of this. Let it not just be the government. Just hold your thoughts there. We'll take a break. We'll take a break. We'll be back with this conversation in a moment. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're watching Business Morning on Channels Television, and we've been discussing the new National Development Plan by the federal government, and I still have here with me Dr. Muda Yusuf. Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf, for sticking by. Just a quick one before I let you run off there. Looking at this plan, what are the risks there? And of course, we're talking so much about private sector role. What kind of proactive role would you want to see, or can the private sector actually play to ensure the realization of this plan?
We're talking about risks. First, risk of sustainability, which you already discussed. Succeeding administration should see this plan as something that they should run with, and we should see government as a continuum that should apply to all levels of government. Secondly, there is also the risk of resource availability. If you have very serious limitations in terms of resources, it could pose a risk to the outcomes of the plan. Third is the capacity to implement. We have very serious capacity issues in government, particularly in the bureaucracy. So that could also pose a risk. I think basically those are the things that one could regard as risks to the implementation of this plan. And in terms of what the private sector can do, I think first, the private sector is ever ready to continue to invest, because the opportunities in this environment is huge. What the private sector is craving for is the right environment to continue to invest. Secondly, is for the private sector to also be responsible corporate citizens. Compliance with tax regulation, with all the regulations that can ensure that we have a very sane and stable economic environment. I think these are some of the responsibilities.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Yusuf.
Thank you very much. Thank you.